Below the streets of Cincinnati lies America's biggest transportation mystery. 2 miles of pristine subway tunnels that never saw a single train. $13 million spent. 7 stations carved from solid rock. 0 passengers. Ever. This wasn't abandoned infrastructure. It was frozen mid-construction in the 1920s and left to rot. Walk above it today and you'd never know that beneath your feet are platforms waiting for commuters who will never arrive. Tunnels designed for trains that were never ordered. Stations with no way down to them. How does a major American city spend the equivalent of $200 million today, move thousands of tons of earth, employ hundreds of workers, and then just stop? How does a project that far along simply die? The evidence still exists, perfectly preserved in the darkness, and the answer reveals something darker than engineering failure. It's a story about civic dreams, economic delusions, and the catastrophic gap between what cities promise and what they can actually deliver. To understand this mystery, you have to dig, both literally and figuratively. And the first clue is in the dirt itself. Cincinnati sits in a river valley built on layers of glacial till, shale, and limestone. The Ohio River carved this valley over millennia, leaving behind a geological mess. The geology here matters because it determined where they could dig and where they couldn't. Unlike New York, which could use cut-and-cover methods through relatively soft soil, Cincinnati's terrain was unpredictable. One block might be easy excavation through clay. The next might hit solid rock, requiring blasting. A third might encounter underground springs that turned everything to mud. The city sits in what geologists call the Cincinnati Arch, an anticline that brings ancient bedrock close to the surface in some areas while leaving deep deposits of glacial material in others. For subway builders, this was a nightmare. You couldn't standardize your digging methods. Every section was different. But here's what's strange. They knew this going in. The geological surveys were done. Engineers had drilled test bores. They understood the challenges. They'd studied the successful subways in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. They knew what they were getting into. Boston's subway, opened in 1897, had cost about $4 million for 1.5 miles. New York's initial line, opened in 1904, cost $35 million for 9 miles. Philadelphia's Market Street subway, opened in 1907, cost $15 million for 2.8 miles. The cost per mile varied, but the pattern was clear. Subways were expensive, and geological challenges made them more expensive. So why did they think they could pull it off when those other cities had massive populations and tax bases? Cincinnati in 1920 had about 400,000 people. New York had over 5 million. Boston had 750,000. Philadelphia had 1.8 million. The math doesn't add up from the start, unless you consider what Cincinnati actually was at that moment in time, and unless you understand what Cincinnati thought it was becoming. Between 1900 and 1920, Cincinnati's population had exploded. German immigrants poured in, fleeing political upheaval in Europe. The city's manufacturing sector, everything from machine tools to playing cards, from soap to beer, was booming. Procter & Gamble was headquartered here. The riverfront was crammed with industry. Steamboats still plied the Ohio River in significant numbers, and critically, the city had just completed one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in America, the Miami-Erie Canal. This matters because it created a specific mindset. Cincinnati saw itself as an engineering city, a city that could move earth and water, a city that conquered geography. The Miami-Erie Canal, completed in 1845, had connected Lake Erie to the Ohio River, making Cincinnati a crucial transportation hub. Yes, railroads had made it obsolete by 1900, but the achievement remained in civic memory. In 1916, the streetcar system was completely overwhelmed. Contemporary accounts describe absolute gridlock. The Cincinnati Traction Company was running 222 cars at peak hours and still couldn't handle demand. At 5th and Vine, The cars would stack up 6 deep, passengers spilling into the streets. The average speed downtown was 3 miles per hour, walking speed. On a bad day, it was slower. A newspaper article from the Cincinnati Enquirer in 1917 described the scene. The corner of 5th and Vine at 5:30 p.m. resembles nothing so much as a stockyard, with human cattle packed so tightly that movement becomes nearly impossible. The air is thick with the smell of bodies and exhaust. The noise is deafening. The clang of streetcar bells, the shouts of conductors, the honking of delivery trucks trapped in the melee. A city engineer named Henry Bentley conducted a comprehensive study. His conclusion: streetcars couldn't solve this. The streets were too narrow. The grid was too congested. Adding more streetcars would only make the problem worse. The only solution was to go underground. But here's where it gets interesting. Bentley's report, published in 1916, included detailed cost estimates. He projected $12 million for a comprehensive system connecting the northern suburbs to downtown and across to the west side. The city's bonding capacity was well below that. The existing debt from water and sewer improvements was already substantial. Any reasonable analysis would have said, we can't afford this. They did it anyway. But not because they were foolish. They thought they'd found a shortcut. Except it is absolutely documented in city planning records and contemporary newspapers. Cincinnati had built the Miami-Erie Canal in the 1820s and 1830s. By the 1910s, it was obsolete. Railroads had killed canal shipping decades earlier. The canal bed ran right through the heart of the city, a weedy, stagnant ditch that had become a civic embarrassment. In summer, it bred mosquitoes. Malaria was a real concern. Factories dumped waste into it. In some sections, it had become a literal open sewer. The canal route was perfect for a subway. It entered the city from the north in Norwood, ran through the dense neighborhoods of St. Bernard and Clifton, passed through the industrial areas of Mohawk and Brighton, and terminated downtown near the riverfront. This was exactly where people needed to go. In 1919, someone, the historical record isn't clear who exactly, though credit is usually given to city planner George Decker, had a brilliant idea. We already own this right-of-way. We've already excavated it once. Why not convert the canal bed into a subway trench? On paper, it was genius. The canal route ran from the northern suburbs straight downtown, hitting every major employment center. The right-of-way was city property. No expensive land acquisition needed. The excavation was partially done. The canal was already a trench cut through the landscape. You could drain it, dig it deeper where necessary, build the subway, and then cover it over. 3 problems solved at once. Get your subway, eliminate the eyesore, and reclaim valuable surface land for development. The cost estimates suddenly looked feasible. Instead of $12 million to dig everything from scratch, they could do it for maybe $6 million using the canal bed for most of the route. Only the downtown sections and the west side extension would require new tunneling. The engineering seemed straightforward. The canal had been stable for nearly a century. Yes, it held water, but it was designed to hold water. Draining it should be simple. The rest was just digging deeper and laying track. The city council approved it. The bonds sold remarkably well. Cincinnati's credit was good, and infrastructure bonds were considered safe investments. Ground broke in 1920 with genuine civic enthusiasm. Newspapers covered it extensively. The mayor posed for photographs at the ceremonial groundbreaking. The city's boosters predicted Cincinnati would become the Queen City of the Midwest reborn, with the most modern transportation system outside of New York. And that's when they discovered the first problem. The canal bed wasn't just full of water. It was full of a century's worth of accumulated muck. Not just water. Underground springs feeding into the canal route. Clay that turned to soup when disturbed. Bedrock that appeared without warning exactly where it wasn't supposed to be. 19th century debris, old boat timbers, lock mechanisms, iron fittings, buried in the muck. And everywhere, water that wouldn't stop flowing. The contractor, CM Osborne Company out of Cleveland, later described it in a report to the city as excavating through hell itself. This wasn't typical hyperbole. They'd drain a section overnight using pumps, and by morning, it would have refilled from underground seepage. They'd shore up walls with timber, and hydrostatic pressure would collapse them within days. They'd plan for soft digging through clay and hit limestone that required dynamite blasting with all the expense and delay that entailed. The canal's original builders had been smart. They'd lined problematic sections with stone and used clay puddle, a mixture of clay and water, to seal the bottom. A century later, nobody knew exactly where those sealed sections were. The old records were incomplete. So, every day brought surprises. One particularly bad incident occurred in April 1921. Workers were excavating near the Brighton neighborhood when they broke through into an underground spring that nobody knew existed. Within 2 hours, the entire work site was flooded. The temporary pumping station couldn't handle the volume. Water rose into nearby basements. A section of Central Avenue developed a sinkhole. The Cincinnati Post headlined the next day, "Subway Project Creates New River." But they kept going because here's what happens with a project like this. Stopping is harder than continuing. You've sold bonds to investors who expect returns. You've made political promises to voters who expect results. You've already spent money, significant money. Labor is hired, with families depending on those paychecks. Equipment is purchased or leased. Contracts are signed with penalty clauses. And most importantly, you've committed to the vision publicly. Stopping means admitting failure. Continuing means maybe pulling off a miracle. By 1922, they'd burned through the original $6 million budget and were nowhere near done. They'd completed about 2 miles of usable tunnel, mostly in the canal bed sections where the work was less complicated than feared. The tunnel itself was impressive. 18 feet wide, 21 feet high, with provisions for a double track. The engineering, where executed, was solid. But the downtown stations, the expensive part, the part that required real underground excavation, were still unfinished. These weren't simple cut-and-cover trenches. These were proper underground stations that had to be blasted out of bedrock, with platforms, mezzanines, passages to the surface, and ventilation shafts. Each station was essentially a small underground building. The city went back to voters for more bond money. And here's a crucial detail that speaks to the psychology of the moment. It passed. In 1923, Cincinnati voters approved an additional $2.5 million in subway bonds. They still believed. Or perhaps more accurately, they'd committed so much already that abandoning the project seemed wasteful. Better to finish it than to let the initial investment rot unused. To understand why the project survived as long as it did, you have to understand Cincinnati's political machine in the 1920s. The Heineck-Pendergrast organization controlled the city's Republican Party, which in turn controlled city government. Rudolf Heineck was the undisputed political boss. He wasn't exactly corrupt in the Tammany Hall sense. There's no evidence of massive graft or stolen funds. But he understood that large public works projects meant jobs, contracts, and political power. The subway wasn't just transportation infrastructure. It was a patronage machine. Contemporary estimates suggest that at peak construction, the subway employed between 400 and 500 workers directly. Add in the indirect employment, equipment suppliers, material vendors, engineers, inspectors, and you're looking at perhaps 1,000 people whose livelihoods were tied to the project. That's 1,000 families with a vested interest in the project continuing. That's 1,000 voters plus their relatives and neighbors. The contracting firms had lawyers and lobbyists who regularly appeared before city council. The bondholders, banks, insurance companies, wealthy individuals wanted their investment to pay off. The newspapers, initially skeptical, had shifted to covering the project as civic progress. Every milestone was celebrated. Every completed section was lauded as proof of Cincinnati's engineering prowess. A whole ecosystem had grown around the subway's construction. Restaurants near the work sites catered to the workers. Boarding houses rented rooms to out-of-town laborers. Local steel fabricators got contracts for structural supports. This was Depression-era economics before the Depression, a kind of Keynesian stimulus before Keynes wrote his general theory. But by 1924, the cracks were showing. The additional $2.5 million from the 1923 bond issue was running out. The work was proceeding, but slowly, and increasingly people were asking hard questions about the financial model. Here's what they had by 1925. 2 miles of completed tunnel, properly lined and ready for track. 3 miles of rough bore, excavated but not finished with concrete lining. 7 station shells in various stages of completion. 0 miles of track laid. 0 electrical systems installed. 0 rolling stock, subway cars, purchased or even ordered. 0 operating plan finalized. And here's what they needed to finish. At minimum, another $7, $8,300,000 to 5 more years of construction. And this is the killer, a revenue model that actually worked. Because now someone finally did the math properly. Not the optimistic projections, not the booster estimates, the actual realistic numbers. A rapid transit system requires density. You need enough people living close enough to stations to generate ridership. You need enough daily commuters, people who ride twice a day, 5 days a week, to make the fare revenue cover operations and debt service. The numbers were damning. Cincinnati's population density in the proposed subway corridor, about 12,000 people per square mile. Compare that to New York's subway-served areas, 60,000 plus per square mile. Boston's subway corridor, 45,000 per square mile. Philadelphia, 40,000 per square mile. Even generous ridership projections, assuming that 30% of corridor residents would use the subway daily, didn't produce enough fare revenue to cover operating costs, much less debt service on the bonds. The subway was designed to serve a city Cincinnati wasn't. It was built for the Cincinnati of someone's optimistic imagination, where growth would continue forever, where the manufacturing boom would never end, where people would live in dense apartment buildings instead of single-family homes. But by 1925, the pattern was clear. Cincinnati was suburbanizing. This was happening in every American city, but Cincinnati's geography made it more pronounced. The hills surrounding the basin were being developed. Streetcar lines were extending outward into places like Hyde Park, Mount Lookout, and Oakley. People with money, the people most likely to be able to afford subway fares, were moving away from the dense urban core the subway was designed to serve. And there was something else, something that nobody had really anticipated in 1920. The automobile. In 1920, automobile ownership in Cincinnati was still relatively rare, expensive, unreliable. The roads were often unpaved outside the downtown core. The streetcar was faster and more convenient. By 1925, everything had changed. Henry Ford's assembly line had driven car prices down dramatically. A Model T, which cost $850 in 1920, was under $300 by 1925. Middle-class families could afford cars, and they were buying them in huge numbers. Cincinnati's automobile registration, 1920, 18,000 vehicles. 1925, 74,000 vehicles. In 5 years, the number of cars had quadrupled. This mattered enormously for the subway's financial model. The projections had assumed that most commuters would have no choice but to use public transit. But now they had a choice. And, increasingly, they were choosing the car. It was private. It was flexible. You could leave when you wanted, go where you wanted, carry groceries or tools or children. The subway's advantages, speed, frequency, capacity, only mattered if enough people used it. And the trend lines suggested they wouldn't. The stock market crash of 1929 is usually cited as the death blow, but that's not quite accurate. The subway was already dying by 1927. The city had stopped requesting additional bond money. The political will was gone. Construction crews were cut to a skeleton staff doing maintenance on the existing tunnels, basically pumping out water and making sure the completed sections didn't collapse. No new digging, no station finishing, no track installation. The last actual construction work occurred in January 1927. A crew completed the concrete lining on a section near the St. Bernard neighborhood. Then they packed up their tools and never came back. There was a brief resurrection attempt in 1928. A new city manager, Clarence Dykstra, was brought in as part of a reform movement that had finally broken the Hanika machine's power. Dykstra was a progressive, a believer in efficient government and scientific management. He looked at the subway and saw not a boondoggle, but an unfinished asset. His proposal was pragmatic. Forget the grand plan. Finish at least a short demonstration line. Maybe just the downtown section, enough to prove the concept. If it worked, if it generated ridership, the rest could follow. The cost estimate, $2.5 million to complete 3 miles with 4 stations and purchase enough rolling stock for basic service. It went to voters in November 1928. It failed badly, 2-1 against. The reasons varied. Some voters saw it as throwing good money after bad. Some had lost faith in city government's ability to manage large projects. Some had bought cars and didn't see the point anymore. Some were influenced by an organized opposition campaign funded by the streetcar company, which saw the subway as competition. That was it. The project was officially dead, though it took several more years for everyone to accept it. The legal battles over the bonds dragged on. Some investors sued, claiming fraud. The city argued force majeure, circumstances beyond control. Eventually, settlements were reached. The bondholders took significant losses, though not total ones. The Great Depression made resurrection impossible. When the stock market crashed in 1929, Cincinnati's municipal finances collapsed with it. Tax revenues plummeted. Unemployment soared. The city was struggling to pay for basic services: police, fire, schools. A subway became not just impractical but absurd, a monument to the hubris of the boom years. And then something interesting happened. Everyone wanted to forget. Cover-up is too strong. Call it civic embarrassment. Call it collective amnesia. Call it the psychological need to move on from failure. Between 1930 and 1950, Cincinnati actively tried to erase the subway from public consciousness. City documents downplayed it. Official maps excluded the tunnel routes. When reporters asked questions, officials gave vague answers about potential future use without providing specifics. The ventilation shafts were sealed. The planned station entrances were filled in or converted to other uses. One became a storage facility for the water department. Another became a garage. The elaborate station building at Race Street, nearly complete, was stripped of anything valuable and left to decay. Some sections were repurposed in minor ways. The tunnel near the waterworks became a storage facility for pipes and equipment. During World War II, another section briefly housed defense-related manufacturing, something about proximity to rail lines and security from aerial observation. The exact nature of that work remains murky in the public record, possibly classified at the time. But mostly, the tunnels just sat. Water seeped in despite the pumps. Mold grew on the walls. Graffiti appeared, though how the graffiti artist got in was never clear. The tunnels became urban legend, whispered about but rarely seen. By the 1950s, a new generation of Cincinnatians had grown up with no memory of the construction. If you mentioned the subway, people looked at you confused. "We don't have a subway. You're thinking of Cleveland." Except Cleveland didn't have a subway either. The forgetting was so complete that in 1962, a city planning document proposed building a rapid transit system and made no mention of the existing tunnels. The consultants apparently didn't know they were there. The modern fascination began in the 1970s, part of the broader urban exploration movement. Young people armed with flashlights and cameras started finding the sealed entrances and sneaking in. Urban exploration wasn't yet a phenomenon with a name, but the impulse was there. Explore the hidden city, the forgotten spaces, the ruins beneath our feet. Local historians started asking questions. Where exactly were the tunnels? How extensive were they? Could they be toured? A reporter from Cincinnati magazine, Jake Mecklenburg, managed to get official access in 1978 and published a photo essay. The images were haunting. Pristine tilework in stations that never opened. Platforms where no one ever waited. Tunnels designed for trains that never arrived. Light fixtures still hung from the ceilings, waiting for electricity that never came. The article hit like a bombshell. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about the subway. The city was flooded with tour requests. Briefly, very briefly, the city considered offering official tours. But the liability concerns were enormous. The tunnels weren't safe, water damage, structural uncertainty, no emergency exits. The idea was abandoned. It hit the national press in 1980. The New York Times ran a feature, America's Biggest Boondoggle. Newsweek followed. National Geographic mentioned it in a piece about abandoned infrastructure. The stories wrote themselves. The cautionary tale of civic ambition gone wrong. Cincinnati's reaction was interesting. Initially defensive, it wasn't a boondoggle. It was an ambitious project that circumstances killed. The city's boosters argued that the vision was sound, just poorly timed. But gradually, a kind of weird pride emerged. The tunnels became Cincinnati's secret, its underground legend. Tours started again briefly before liability concerns shut them down again. Documentaries were filmed. The subway became part of the city's identity, proof that Cincinnati had once dreamed big. But here's what's strange. In all that coverage, in all those articles and documentaries and books, nobody could quite agree on why it failed. Theory 1. Bad engineering. The geology was impossible. The costs were underestimated and the project was technically doomed from the start. Evidence supporting this: the constant flooding problems, the unpredictable soil conditions, the cost overruns that doubled and tripled initial estimates, the fact that even the completed sections required constant maintenance to keep water out. If the engineering were sound, why did it cost so much more than projected? Counter evidence. 2 miles of perfectly functional tunnel were completed and remain structurally sound today, nearly a century later. The engineering worked where it was properly executed. Other cities built subways through challenging geology. It wasn't impossible, just harder and more expensive than hoped. Theory 2. Political corruption. The machine politicians kept the project alive beyond any rational justification to keep the patronage flowing and the contracts coming. Evidence supporting this: the high-nickel machines' tight control over city government, the fact that contracts went to firms with political connections, the resistance to ending the project even as costs spiraled, the way additional funding was approved despite warning signs. If this was purely a technical project, why the political protection? Counter evidence: voters approved additional funding in a public referendum in 1923. If it was pure corruption, if the public saw it as a machine boondoggle, why would citizens support it? The 1928 referendum failed not because people thought it was corrupt, but because they thought it was impractical. Theory 3. Economic timing. The project was viable in 1920, but the economy and city demographics shifted faster than anyone anticipated. Evidence supporting this: the population trends showing suburbanization accelerating through the 1920s, the rise of the automobile changing transportation patterns fundamentally, the Depression eliminating any possibility of finishing, the way other cities that built subways in the early 1900s succeeded while Cincinnati's 1920s project failed. Timing matters enormously in infrastructure. Counter evidence: these trends were visible by 1923, yet the city and voters doubled down with more funding. Smart people saw the same data and still believed the project could work. Were they all blind? Or was there genuinely a reasonable case that the subway could reshape development patterns rather than just follow them? Theory 4. Vision failure. Cincinnati tried to build infrastructure for a city it wanted to be rather than the city it was. Evidence supporting this: the density requirements that Cincinnati never met, the ridership projections that were wildly optimistic. The way the plan assumed continued growth and densification when the opposite was happening. The civic boosterism that blinded leaders to reality. This was a fantasy city's subway, not a real city's. Counter evidence: Other cities successfully built subways with similar population sizes. The vision wasn't inherently impossible, and arguably, if the subway had been completed, it might have shaped development patterns. Rapid transit can create density, not just serve it. We'll never know because the experiment was never run. The truth? Probably all of them. Rarely is civic failure monocausal. More likely, it was a perfect storm, challenging engineering that exceeded cost estimates, political forces that kept the project alive past rational termination, economic changes that undermined the basic assumptions, and a vision that was just ambitious enough to be inspiring, but not quite realistic enough to work. So, here's what we're left with, nearly a century later. Beneath Cincinnati, there are 2 miles of usable rapid transit tunnel. Modern engineering assessments say they're structurally sound. The concrete is good. The dimensions are right for modern light rail. Conversion costs would be significant, but not impossible. Somewhere between $50, $80 million to bring them up to modern safety standards, install track, and connect them to surface stations. The route still makes sense. It connects neighborhoods that need transit. It runs through areas that are densifying again after decades of decline. The urban core is experiencing a renaissance. Young people are moving back downtown. The kind of density that the subway needed in 1920 is finally appearing in 2026. Every few years, someone proposes using them. Light rail proposals in 1989, 2002, and 2008. A bus rapid transit idea in 2016. A streetcar extension study in 2021. Every proposal includes maps showing the existing tunnels highlighted. Every proposal notes the money that could be saved by using existing infrastructure. And every proposal dies in feasibility studies that conclude the same thing. It's cheaper to build new than to finish old. The tunnels would need so much remediation, waterproofing, ventilation, emergency exits, ADA-compliant stations, that the cost savings vanish. Better to start fresh, on the surface, with modern design standards, and that might be the real lesson. Sunk costs aren't just economic, they're psychological. The tunnels represent failure, and cities don't like to build on failure's foundation. Better to start fresh, somewhere else, with a clean slate. Never mind that it's wasteful. Never mind that the tunnels are there, waiting. The stigma is too great. But walk along Central Parkway today. Look at the ventilation grates, rusted but still present. The sealed tunnel entrances, some of them now hidden behind buildings or parking lots. The station buildings that were converted to warehouses and shops, their original purpose erased, but their architecture hinting at something grander. The infrastructure is still there, still waiting, preserved by its very uselessness. $13 million, $200 million in today's money, bought Cincinnati 2 miles of tunnel and a question that won't die. What if they'd finished? Could rapid transit have changed Cincinnati's trajectory? Would dense urban development have clustered around stations the way it did in Boston and New York and Philadelphia? Would downtown have remained vital instead of hollowing out through the 1960s and 70s? Would the city look different today? More compact, more walkable, less car-dependent? Or was the automobile always going to win? Was suburbanization inevitable? Was the subway a nostalgic grasp at 19th century urbanism in a 20th century world that had already moved on? Were the planners fighting against economic forces too powerful to resist? We can't know. The experiment was never completed. The test was never run. Cincinnati built the laboratory, but never conducted the research. And so the tunnels wait, dark and empty, one of America's greatest might-have-beens. A cautionary tale about ambition and timing and the vast distance between civic dreams and civic reality. A reminder that infrastructure doesn't just reflect cities, it shapes them. And the absence of infrastructure shapes them too. The ultimate mystery isn't why the subway failed. Engineers can explain the technical problems, economists can explain the financial collapse, historians can explain the political dynamics. We have answers to those questions even if we argue about which answer matters most. The real mystery is deeper. What Cincinnati might have been if it hadn't failed? That question can never be answered. It exists in the realm of counterfactual history, forever unknowable. And perhaps that's fitting. The subway to nowhere leads to the city that never was. Both exist only as possibilities, as dreams deferred, as evidence of the distance between what we plan and what we build, between what we hope and what we achieve. The tunnels remain. The question remains. And Cincinnati, like all of us, lives with both.